Hi all, welcome to the Conversation on Sustainable Mountains podcast, a podcast to talk about the sustainable development of the mountains together with key experts. My name is Carla Lostrangio from the European Association on Local Innovation, and today I'm here with Teresa Pinto-Correia. Teresa, you are a geographer with a background in environmental management and landscape ecology. You're also full professor at the University of Évora in Portugal, director of the Associate Lab Change, and member of the Portuguese Council on Science, Technology and Innovation. Since 2019, you are also vice chair of the Horizon Europe Mission Board on Soil and Health. So today you are here with us on behalf of the European project Moving, where you have been coordinating the work on spatial analysis of the mountains and their vulnerability to different drivers of change. Change and vulnerability in the mountains are exactly the topics of this first episode. In a scenario of global change, mountains are exposed to different threats that increase their vulnerability. As it emerged from your research, to understand the vulnerability of mountains today, we should understand what new threats are. So let's start with this, Teresa. What does threats mean, and what are the most common threats affecting mountain areas today?
I think what we need to understand in terms of concept is that threats relate to hazards, to processes which are normally in a negative way affecting something, affecting a region, affecting the livelihood of people, affecting the communities. So it's an event or a process which is affecting these resources or people. And what we analyzed in the project, in Moving, was particularly which threats were affecting mountain regions, a large set of mountain regions in Europe, and in which way the regions were reacting. So vulnerability relates to this. Vulnerability relates to there's a process, so there's an hazard, an event, and maybe the land use or the community can be affected by it or not, and it can be more or less severely affected. So there's different levels, even if there's this change, not all assets or all members of a community or all resources are affected in the same way. There is a large set of these threats which are related with climate change. Mountains are particularly susceptible to climate change because the variations with altitudes are very significant. And the small changes in precipitation and in temperature from one layer to the other layer in altitude mean that the mosaic of vegetation and of natural resources available in the mountains were extremely different, and they are somehow changing now because the climate is changing. So this is a group of drivers, of threats, which were identified as relevant in most of the regions we studied. But then there are other types of drivers which are also threats. The most relevant was the population. And then there are other types of threats changing the resources like tourism. When tourism becomes too intense or too concentrated, it can also be a threat for the natural resources. It can be a threat for the way the land use is changed. And then it may create instability, for instance, in land cover. And then there are changes in the land cover themselves. So options of change from one farming system to another one, from farming to forestry, or from one type of forest to another one, more simplified, more plantations instead of natural forest. And this can also be threats because they affect the balance which existed before. So what we found out in Moving was that for sure climate change, like reduction of precipitation, increase in temperature, frequency of extreme events, these ones are considered as threats in most of the regions. But then there's a very strong diversity of the combination of these ones with the other threats. So almost each region has a particular set of drivers that is affecting the region mostly. So recognizing this diversity, acknowledging this diversity seems to be really a key message of Moving, that we cannot consider all regions in Europe being under the same threats with the same intensity. The diversity is very strong.
Thanks, Teresa, for such a complete, picture of your work and your results. Also, if I'm not mistaken, in moving, you have deployed some participatory techniques to identify the mountain vulnerability to new threats. And therefore, I'm really curious, can anyone make use of participatory techniques and assess the vulnerability of their own mountain area, and how eventually?
This is a very interesting question because it's mostly a key dimension of the moving project. Our starting positioning was that the differentiation of mountains is big, and those who are connected with the resources and using these resources locally are those who know best how changes which are occurring maybe at a higher level are affecting specifically the region. So not avoiding the past, but asking the local experts, which are the local stakeholders, how much is your production system affected by this lack of precipitation? What is exactly which is affected? So we started by creating, in moving, we approached the regions with a focus on a smaller area, which is a mountain reference landscape. So we had these 23 mountain reference regions. And within each region, we selected a reference landscape, which was more connected with the value chain we were studying, because we selected one value chain, one product, which depends on the endogenous resources. So this was a part of the methodology of moving. And then we selected a landscape where this value chain was connected to. And we believed and we thought that if the area is smaller, then we'll be able to involve stakeholders. So this was the first step, was to create this community of practice, where the idea was really that people would know each other and will interact, and we were promoters, we were the facilitators of the discussion. And we showed them the data we could collect. We could collect enormous amounts of data from IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, but also data on depopulation, data on land cover and land cover changes, on erosion risk. So all the data we could collect, we showed them. And then we asked them which ones from all these we can see which is changing in your region, in your landscape, so in this smaller area, which are the ones you believe are most relevant and which are really affecting most, and we need to tackle if we want to keep the balance and the landscape characteristics of the region. And it's very interesting because they really have something to say. I mean, maybe they are people which have not thought about IPCC scenarios before, but when you show them, they can say, well, this question is particularly relevant because it increases the risk that we do not have productivity enough for our sheep, for the grazing of our sheep, and then the sheep will go down in the valley, and then the shrub will increase, and then we'll have more risks of fire. So the very fine-grained mechanisms of change in the use of resources caused by these changes, by these drivers, it's the stakeholders who can give us. And we were informing them, we were giving them somehow the toolbox. So we said, well, this is our methodology, this is the data we have, which is a downscale of very large sets of data. What do you think about this? Have you realized this before? Are you aware? How does it affect? And by this, we created a discussion in several steps.
Thanks, Teresa. And indeed, I like it that you talk about local stakeholders and, in fact, the importance of making them involved and rely on their expertise, because they are really the local experts. And this bringing towards this last question. And in your work, have you looked at the most urgent measures that local actors should implement to adapt to those new threats you were speaking about? And also, do you think that local actors, they do actually have sufficient skills to adapt?
I think some of the tools which we have been discussing, because that we also discussed with stakeholders, some of the tools, they are already in place. Many of them were referring to something they have experimented or they heard about or could be experimented in some places. And they are very much relying on public policies, on the intervention of public policies to create mechanisms for instance, for keeping areas cleaned or clean of shrub. I'm talking a lot about this because it seems to be a huge problem, this shrub encroachment. But these mechanisms very often have been applied locally with some programs which are, programs related with projects or related with one specific initiative. So there are not many of the proposals of tools which could be used, which are totally new. Many of them are already existing, but they have been experimented and they're not continued. So one big challenge is to have kind of strategy, long-term strategy for each mountain region, where the fundamental mechanisms or tools can be discussed and set in place and then continued in time. And for this, I think that's the question of skills, which maybe is missing, because a lot of it would rely on networks between, for instance, producers and those who use the natural resources, and then other actors in the value chain. And this integration is a bit difficult, because very often the consumption part of the value chain is outside the mountain. And so engaging, for instance, consumers, when it's about the food product, engaging consumers in being able to maybe pay more for the product because the way the product is produced is preserving a resource in the mountains. It's something which is occurring in niche products and with niche groups of consumers, but it's not generalized. So what I think it's important to think is that it's not enough to have small projects about valorization of one product or about cooperation where there's a cooperation for creating some mechanism if it then stops after 2 or 3 years, because these communities are weak. There's very few people. Very often the technical skills are there, but not the more soft skills for continuing collaboration even when a project is closed, or finding new ways of financing. These are very, very tiny initiatives which are needed, and very often if one link is not there, then it collapses. For sure, mainly soft skills are missing, I would say, of networking, organizing, and keeping on going with solutions, even when one small funding or big funding is finished. So this is a big problem of the way very often these mechanisms to reverse a decay process are implemented as short-term initiatives. And then people get a bit of enthusiasm, some solutions are created, but then we would need to have possibility to keep it in the long term, and really so that the actors really believe there's a will of investment in keeping this region alive and in keeping its characteristic landscape. And we can continue investing here, and we will be supported also in the long term. So I think the long term, the long or the short and medium term strategy, but with a long term perspective, it's extremely important.
Teresa, I would like to thank you for joining us today. It has been wonderful to exchange and learn about change and vulnerability in the mountains from your own experience and work, and also about possible way to drive adaptation. And I hope that all listeners enjoy this first episode and are also eager to learn more during our next episode, which will explore the diversity of Europe's mountains. See you there.